Students, today we discuss connective tissues, muscular tissue and nervous tissue. Before going to the connective tissue, we have to discuss some fingertip points. All varieties of connective tissue are derived from mesoderm. The connective tissue is broadly classified into connective tissue proper, supporting tissues and fluid connective tissue. As we observe the supporting tissue, what are the supporting tissues? One we call it as cartilage and the second one we call it as bone. What is the other name of the bony tissue? The osseous tissue. What are the examples for the fluid connective tissue? The examples for the fluid connective tissue are, one we call it as blood and the second one we call it as lymph. Now as we observe the connective tissue proper, the connective tissue proper is broadly classified into embryonic connective tissue and mature connective tissue. The embryonic connective tissue is classified into, one we call it as mesenchyme and the second one we call it as mucus. What about the mature connective tissue? It is broadly classified into loose connective tissue and the dense connective tissue. The loose connective tissue is classified into areolar tissue, adipose tissue and reticular tissue. What about the dense connective tissue? It is classified into dense regular connective tissue, dense irregular connective tissue and the last one we call it as elastic. Now we have to discuss the bits regarding the EAMCET point of view in the connective tissue. In the connective tissue, one category we call it as connective tissue proper and the second one we call it as supporting tissues, third one we call it as fluid connective tissues and the next one we call it as muscle tissue and the last one we call it as nervous tissue. Now we have to discuss the bits regarding this one. Now the first one. Now you have to observe the bits one after another. The first one we call it as the reticular fibers are made up of. Now I am giving one hint to this question. As we observe the matrix, in the matrix of connective tissue, the fibroblasts are present. The fibroblast will produce what type of fibers? One we call it as white collagen fibers and the second one we call it as yellow elastin fibers and the third one we call it as reticular fibers. Now we have to observe the first question. The reticular fibers are made up of, the first answer we call it as actin and the second one we call it as collagen and the third one we call it as elastin and the fourth one we call it as myosin. Now basing these hints, you have to identify the answer for this question. Reticular fibers are made up of, the correct answer is collagen. Now we go for the next question. What is the second question? Vasodilators secreted by mast cells. Now I am giving the hints for this question. As we observe the matrix of connective tissue, in the matrix of connective tissue the mast cells are present. The mast cells secrete what type of materials? One we call it as histamine, the second one we call it as bradykinin and the third one we call it as heparin. We know very well the heparin, it is called anticoagulant. It prevents the clotting of blood. Now what are the vasodilators secreted by mast cells? Now the first option is heparin, second one we call it as histamines, third one we call it as acetylcholine and the fourth one we call it as vasopressin. Now you have to observe the correct answer for this question. The mast cells secrete histamine and bradykinin. Now you have to observe the answer for this question. The answer for this question is the histamines. What is the second vasodilator? The bradykinin. Now go for the third question. Deeper regions of dermis of skin is formed by. Now I am giving some few hints regarding this question. Now repeating the question once again. Deeper regions of dermis of skin is formed by. As we observe the skin of the animals, the skin is broadly classified into, one we call it as epidermis and the second one we call it as dermis. In the epidermis, two layers are present. In the dermis, two layers are present. Now regarding this question, the deeper regions of dermis of skin is formed by. Now observe the options. One we call it as a reticular tissue. The second one we call it as a dense irregular connective tissue. The third one we call it as a dense regular connective tissue. And the fourth one we call it as a yellow elastic tissue. I am giving some hint regarding this question. Now as we observe the mature connective tissue, it is broadly classified into loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. The dense connective tissue is classified into dense regular and dense irregular. In the dense irregular connective tissue, the fibers are irregularly arranged. What type of fibers are irregularly arranged? The white collagen fibers are irregularly arranged. Based on this hint, you have to observe the answer for this question. Deeper regions of dermis of skin is formed by, what is the correct answer? The dense irregular connective tissue. Now the answer is the second one. Now we go for the fourth question. Gristle is derived from. Now what are the introductory points regarding this question? As we observe the supporting tissues are two types. One we call it as cartilage and the second one we call it as bone. What is the other name of bone? That we call it as osseous tissue. Now here the question is gristle. What is the other name of cartilage tissue? That we call it as gristle. The gristle is derived from what type of germ layer? All connective tissues are derived from the mesoderm. Now based on these hints, you have to identify the correct answer for this question. Now I am repeating the question. Gristle is derived from. Now what is meant by gristle? Nothing but the cartilage. Now you have to eliminate the answer for this question. One we call it as ectoderm, and the second one we call it as mesoderm, and the third one we call it as endoderm, and the fourth one we call it as ectoendodermal tissue. Now what is the correct answer for this question? The mesoderm. Now we go for the next question. The outer covering of gristle. Now as we observe the cartilage, it is one example for the supporting tissue. Now as we observe the cartilage is covered and protected by perichondrium. The bone is covered and protected by periosteum. The periosteum, the perichondrium, all these are made by what type of connective tissue? That is dense irregular connective tissue. Now regarding this question, you have to observe the question once again. The outer covering of gristle. Now the first one is periosteum. The second one we call it as perichondrium. The third one we call it as pendosteum. And the fourth one we call it as meninx. Now based on this information, you have to pick out the correct answer for this question. What is the correct answer for the outer covering of the gristle? Is the perichondrium. That is the second answer. Now move for the next question. Costal cartilage is seen in. Before going to the costal cartilage, now this part we call it as the rib. Now this part we call it as rib. And this one we call it as dorsal side. And this one we call it as ventral side. Now on the ventral side of rib, what type of cartilage is present? That we call it as hyaline cartilage. Now as we observe the cartilage, in the cartilage, one we call it as hyaline cartilage, and the second one we call it as elastic cartilage, and the third one we call it as fibrous cartilage. Regarding this question, what is the costal cartilage? Now as we observe the rib, on the ventral side of rib, what is present? Hyaline cartilage. Here the hyaline cartilage is technically known as. Now you have to observe the question. Costal cartilage is seen in. One option is the tips of long bones. For example, this is the long bone, this is the tip. Now the first one is the tips of long bones, and the second one we call it as the center of the sternum, and the third one we call it as between the joints, and the fourth one we call it as ventral ends of ribs. Again I am repeating the answer. Now this part we call it as rib. On the ventral side of rib, what is present? The hyaline cartilage. Here the hyaline cartilage technically called the costal cartilage. Now what is the answer for this question? The fourth option is the correct answer. Now go for the next question. The weakest cartilage. Now as we observe the kinds of cartilage, One we call it as hyaline cartilage, and the second one we call it as elastic cartilage, and the third one we call it as fibrous cartilage. As we observe the hyaline cartilage, in the hyaline cartilage matrix consisting very delicate collagen fibers. When compared to that of the remaining types, what is the weakest cartilage? That we call it as hyaline cartilage. Now you have to observe the answers. One we call it as hyaline cartilage, second one elastic, third one fibrous, and the fourth one calcified. Now you can easily identify the answer for this question. That we call it as hyaline cartilage. Now we go for the next question. Irregular bones are. First you have to observe the answers. Wrist and ankle bones, vertebrae, cranial bones, and humerus. Now as we observe the dorsal side of the body, on the dorsal side of the body, what is present? The vertebral column. In the vertebral column, what type of bones are present? Vertebrae. The vertebrae that are present in the vertebral column are the irregular shaped bones. Now this part we call it as wrist. The bones present in the wrist are short bones. In the same way as we observe the ankle, in the ankle also the bones are short bones. Now this part we call it as upper arm. In the upper arm the bones are long. Now in this part what type of bones are present? Radio ulna. They are also long bones. Now what our question is, what are the irregular bones? On the dorsal side of our body, what is present? The vertebral column. In the vertebral column, what type of bones are present? Vertebrae. The vertebrae is an example of for this question. Now you have to observe the answer for this question. The second answer, vertebrae. Now we move for the next question. The swollen terminals of long bones are called. Now as we observe one long bone, now this is a swollen part. Now this is the middle part. Again this is the swollen part. Now this is one long bone. Now we are getting one doubt. What are the long bones? The bone it is present in the upper arm, that we call it as humerus. The bones present in the forearm we call it as radio ulna. The bone present in the thigh we call it as femur. The bone present in the shank we call it as tibiofibula. Now here what is the question? What are these swollen parts? Now this is one long bone. This is swollen part. This is swollen part. This part we call it as epiphysis, and this part we call it as epiphysis. Now you have to observe the answer for this question. The swollen terminals of long bones are called. One we call it as diaphysis, second one we call it as epiphysis, third one we call it as occipital condyles, and the fourth one we call it as the shaft. Now you have to immediately guess answer for this question. That is the second option, we call it as epiphysis. Now go for the next question. Red bone marrow is present in. Now as we observe the long bone, this is the long bone, this part we call it as epiphysis. In the epiphysis, the matrix is arranged in the form of ridges. They are called trabeculae. Between the trabeculae, what is present? The hemopoietic tissue. Such hemopoietic tissue we call it as red bone marrow. Why it is called red bone marrow? Here the hemopoietic tissue produces all varieties of the blood cells. Now you have to observe the question. Red bone marrow is present in. One option is the shaft of the bone, and the second one we call it as epiphysis, and the third one we call it as diaphysis, and the fourth one we call it as compact bone. Now based on this information, you have to guess the answer for this question. Where the red bone marrow is present? In the epiphysis. Now what is the answer for this question? The second answer. Now move for the next question. Match the following. Now you have to carefully observe the list 1 and list 2. Match the following. Now in the first one, what is present? The leukocyte, and the second one we call it as monocyte, and the third one we call it as the lymphocyte, and the basophil, eosinophil, and neutrophil. Now again you have to carefully observe the options. Now on one side, what is present? Leukocyte. What is meant by leukocyte? WBC. Now in this column, what are present? Variety of WBC. What is the first one? Monocyte. What is the second one? Lymphocyte. What is the third one? Basophil. What is the fourth one? Eosinophil. What is the last one? Neutrophil. Now move for the next side. What type of nucleus? Now the first one is bilobed, and the second one we call it as irregular, and the third one we call it as kidney shaped, and the next one we call it as trilobed, and the last one we call it as spherical. Now I am giving some hints regarding this question. As we observe the WBC are broadly classified into granulocytes and agranulocytes. Now what are the granulocytes? One we call it as neutrophils, second one we call it as eosinophils, and the third one we call it as basophils. As we observe the neutrophils, in the neutrophils the nucleus are many-lobed. What about the eosinophils? The nucleus is bilobed. What about the basophil? Here the nucleus is irregularly lobed. Now what about the agranulocytes? For the agranulocytes, two examples are present. One we call it as a lymphocyte, and the second one we call it as monocyte. In the lymphocyte, what type of nucleus? Spherical shaped. What about the monocyte? In the monocyte, the nucleus is kidney shaped or rennet or kidney shaped. Now you have to observe the answer. Now monocyte. In the monocyte, what type of nucleus is present? The kidney shaped nucleus. What about the lymphocyte? What type of nucleus? The spherical nucleus. What about the basophil? The nucleus having irregular lobes. What about the eosinophils? The nucleus is divided into two lobes, that we call it as bilobed. And the last one we call it as neutrophil. In the neutrophil, the nucleus may be trilobed or many-lobed or five-lobed. Whatever it may be, answer is correct for the neutrophil. Now we go for the next question. Now here assertion and reason. As we observe the RBC of mammals, in case of mammals, the RBC is the biconcave and circular. We are having a good idea regarding the RBC. Take for example Pisces, amphibians, reptiles and aves. In all these animals, what type of RBC is present? The RBC is oval, biconvex and nucleated. But here we are discussing the mammals. In case of mammals, what type of RBC is present? The RBC is circular and biconcave. In all mammals, whenever the RBC completely mature, what is totally absent? The nucleus absent. Now you have to observe the assertion. The biconcave shape of erythrocyte, that means RBC. The biconcave shape of erythrocyte facilitates efficient gas exchange. Now the oxygen enters into and carbon dioxide comes out. We know very well the exchange of gases. Now the assertion is 100% correct. Now we go for the reason. The biconcave shape provides a large surface area to volume ratio. This biconcave RBC, the biconcave shape provides a large surface area to volume ratio. So that because of this shape, there is efficient gas exchange. Now you have to imagine the correct answer for this question. Both are correct or explains A. So that the answer for this question is 1. Now we move for the next question. Now, only leukocytes that exhibit reverse diapedices. Now what is meant by diapedices? Now this one we call it as blood vessel. In the blood vessel, what is flowing? The blood plasma is flowing. Now this star mark we call it as the WBC. In the WBC, variety of WBC are present. One we call it as neutrophil, and the second one we call it as eosinophil, and the third one we call it as basophil, and the fourth one we call it as lymphocyte, and the next one we call it as the monocyte. Now the WBC come out of the blood vessel into surrounding tissues. The T means tissues. Now the WBC come out of the blood vessels, enter into the tissues. That process we call it as diapedices. Diapedices. What is meant by diapedices? The WBC come out of the blood vessels. But here what is the question? Only leukocytes. What is meant by leukocyte? WBC. Only WBC that exhibit reverse diapedices. It means after diapedices, after coming the blood vessels, again it enter into the blood stream. That is the meaning for this question. Now you have to imagine the answer for this question. One we call it as monocyte. It never re-enter the blood stream. Now the second one is basophil, and the third one is neutrophil, and the last one we call it as lymphocyte. The lymphocyte comes out of the blood vessel by diapedisis. After diapedisis, again it re-enters into the blood stream. So that, what is the correct answer for this question? The fourth one, that is the lymphocyte. Now we go for the next question. Subcutaneous layer that binds skin to the underlying tissues is formed by. Before going to the answer for this question, we have to identify some tips. Now as we observe the connective tissue proper, the mature connective tissue is broadly classified into mature and dense. In the mature connective tissue, one variety we call it as areolar tissue. Now as we observe this part, we call it as skin. Below skin, what is present? The subcutaneous tissue. Now the skin is attached to subcutaneous tissue. In the subcutaneous tissue, what is present? Adipose tissue. Now the skin is attached to subcutaneous tissue by, you have to observe the options. The subcutaneous layer that binds skin to the underlying tissues is formed by, one is reticular and dense connective tissue. The second one is white and brown adipose tissue. And the third one is dense and elastic connective tissue. Now what is the last one? Areolar adipose. Now here what is the correct answer? You have to guess. The correct answer is the fourth one. That is areolar and adipose tissue. Now we go for the next question. Stroma of bone marrow, spleen, lymph nodes and liver is formed by. Once again I am repeating the questions. The stroma of bone marrow. Now you know very well, this is the long bone. This part we call it as shaft or diapedicis. Only in the diapedicis what is present? The bone marrow. Now you have to observe the stroma of bone marrow and the stroma of spleen and the stroma of lymph nodes and the stroma of liver is formed by. Now you have to observe the options. The dense regular connective tissue, areolar connective tissue, reticular connective tissue and dense irregular connective tissue. For this question I am giving hints. Now as we observe the mature connective tissue, the mature connective tissue is broadly classified into areolar tissue. The areolar tissue is popularly known as binding tissue. And the second one we call it as adipose tissue, where the adipose tissue present around the eyeballs. It is present in the palms, it is present in the soles, and it is present around the kidneys, etc. And the last one we call it as reticular tissue. Now you have to identify the correct answer for this question. What is the correct answer for this question? Is the reticular connective tissue. The stroma of bone marrow, spleen, lymph nodes and liver is formed by reticular connective tissue. Now we go for the next question. Now you have to observe, read the statements. For these questions, first of all, you have to study the question. What is the asking question? Read the statements. Now we don't go for the statements. Now we go for the next sentence. Which of the above are true about osseous tissue? Now we are getting an idea. What is the osseous tissue? The bony tissue is called osseous tissue. Now if you are getting the answer for the osseous tissue, what is the osseous tissue? Bony tissue. Now we can easily eliminate the statements regarding the osseous tissue. Now you have to read the first statement. Epiphysis consists of trabeculae and red bone marrow. Now you observe the long bone. In the long bone, this solid part is called epiphysis. In the epiphysis, what are present? Trabeculae and hemopoietic tissue. That hemopoietic tissue we call it as a red bone marrow. Now epiphysis consists of trabeculae and red bone marrow. 100% correct statement. Now the second one we call it as sesamoid bones are formed due to the ossification of ligaments. Now we know very well what is meant by sesamoid bone. This part we call it as kneecap. The kneecap is also called patella, also called sesamoid bone. It is formed by the ossification of tendon but not the ligaments. So the second option is wrong. Now the third one we go for metaphysis as a fibrous cartilaginous epiphyseal plates we are asking the statements regarding the osseous tissue. In the osseous tissue, we should not explain the cartilage, so that metaphysis has a fibrous cartilaginous epiphyseal plate which allow the diaphysis to grow in length. Why it is wrong? We are discussing regarding the bony tissue but not the cartilage. So the third one is wrong. What about the fourth one? Aversion canals are parallel to marrow cavity. Now you have to observe the diagram. This is the transverse section of the diaphysis or shaft. Now in the shaft, what is present? The marrow cavity. Now all these are the aversion canals. How the aversion canals are arranged? They are arranged longitudinally. The aversion canals are connected by a transverse canal that we call it as Walkman's canal. Now what is the correct answer for this question? Which of the above are true about the osseous tissue? The first answer, that is epiphysis consists of trabeculae and red bone marrow, and aversion canals are parallel to the marrow cavity. Now we go for the next question. Hematocrit. Now as we observe the introductory part of the fluid connective tissue, in the fluid connective tissue, one we call it as blood plasma and the second one we call it as lymph. Now this is the test tube. In the test tube, we have to take a small amount of blood plasma. Now it is subjected to centrifugation. In the bottom part, what is present? The RBC. This is the hint for this question. Now you have to identify. Hematocrit is, what is the first one? The percentage of total blood occupied by formed elements. And now the percentage of blood volume occupied by erythrocytes and the percentage of total blood volume occupied by leukocytes and the percentage of total blood volume occupied by plasma. Always in the bottom, what is present? RBC. Above that, what is present? A white buffy coat that we call it as WBC. Now we are getting an idea regarding this question. What is the answer for the hematocrit? You identify the answer for this question. The percentage of total blood volume occupied by erythrocytes. The answer is 2. What is the erythrocyte? Nothing but the RBC. Now go for the next question. Now here in this question, they have given some statements, but we don't know what are the statements regarding to what. Now you have to identify the characters, supplements of mast cells from the above. Now once again, you have to observe this statement. Identify the characters of supplements of mast cells. Now how to get the answer for this question? We know very well the mast cells. The mast cells secrete histamine, bradykinin and heparin. Here what they asked? Supplements of mast cell. Whenever the mast cell is absent, the mast cell's function is performed by what type of cells? That we call it as the basophils. Now according to this question, what are the supplements of the basophils? Supplements of the mast cells, the basophils. Now you have to study the statements. In basophils, the nucleus is divided into irregular lobes, 100% correct. Now the second one is specific granules are fewer and irregular in size and shape. And the third one is C, they are phagocytic. And D, large specific granules increase in number during allergic reactions. Now E, among various types of formed elements, they are less in number. Now you have to guess the answer. The answer is first. It means regarding the supplements of mast cells, basophils. What are the statements correct regarding the basophils? The nucleus is divided into irregular lobes. And the second one is specific granules are less in number and irregular in size and shape. And the third one, basophils are not at all phagocytic. And the D, large specific granules increase in number during allergic reactions. For that statement, what is the correct answer? Eosinophils. But we are asking the correct statement for the basophils. Now what is the E statement? Among various types of the formed elements, they are less in number. Now as we observe the WBC, the basophils number is very less, just 0.4%. Now what is the correct answer? The first answer, that is A, B, E statements. Now we go for the next question. Identify the areas concerned with the cartilage without perichondrium but belonging to two different histological types of cartilages. Now you carefully read the question. Identify the areas concerned with the cartilage without perichondrium. Now I am giving the hints for this question. As we observe the cartilage, one we call it as a hyaline cartilage. In the hyaline cartilage, one example we call it as costal cartilage. Another example is epiphyseal plates. And the next example we call it as articular cartilage. In these examples, the perichondrium is absent. The second one we call it as elastic cartilage. And the last one we call it as fibrous cartilage. Where we have to find the fibrous cartilage, one we call it as intervertebral discs and the second one we call it as pubic symphysis. Here they are asking, identify the areas concerned with the cartilage without perichondrium. We are getting an idea regarding without perichondrium. One is hyaline cartilage and the second one is fibrous cartilage. In the hyaline cartilage, only in the few examples what is absent, the perichondrium. Now you have to guess answer for this question. First option, intervertebral discs and pubic symphysis. Articular cartilage, epiphyseal plates. Costal cartilage and epiphyseal plates. And the fourth one is articular cartilage, intervertebral disc. Here the student get a small inconvenience regarding the answers. Now you have to identify once again the question. Identify the areas concerned with the cartilage without perichondrium but belonging to two different histological types. That means one go for the hyaline cartilage, one go for the fibrous cartilage. Based on that, what are the answers? The fourth answer you have to observe, articular cartilage, intervertebral disc. Articular cartilage come under the hyaline cartilage, intervertebral discs come under the fibrous cartilage. Two different histological areas. So the correct answer is the fourth option. Now we go for the next question. Walls of heart are made up of. Now as we observe the four-chambered heart in all mammals, whatever it may be, whether it is the heart of fishes or amphibians or reptiles or eus mammals. Now this part we call it as the heart. Now this is tricuspid wall, bicuspid wall. Now here what is the question? Walls of heart are made up of. One option is dense regular connective tissue. Dense regular connective tissue is present only in the tendon and ligament. Now what about the dense irregular connective tissue? It is present in the perichondrium, in the periosteum, in the pericardium, etc. Now the next one is elastic connective tissue and the last one we call it as reticular connective tissue. Now you have to identify the answer for this question. I have given some clues regarding this question. The dense irregular connective tissue present in the periosteum, perichondrium, pericardium, etc. Now what is the correct answer for this question? You have to identify. Now the answer is second option. That means the dense irregular connective tissue. It is present in perichondrium, periosteum, pericardium and walls, etc. Now we go for the next. We go for the next topic. Now in the what are the next part in the connective tissue? In the connective tissue, one we discussed the connective tissue proper, and the second one we call it as supporting tissue, that we call it as cartilage and the bone, and the next one we call it as fluid connective tissue, and we are going to discuss the muscle tissue and nervous tissue. Now we have to discuss the lymph, muscle tissue and nervous tissue. Now we have to discuss the lymph, and the next one we discuss the muscle tissue. Next one we discuss the nervous tissue. Now initially I am giving small points regarding the lymph. In our body, as we observe some parts, the blood is supplied in the form of the lymph. What is the major difference between the blood and the lymph? In the blood RBC present, whereas in the lymph the RBC absent. In the blood, hemoglobin present, whereas in the lymph, hemoglobin is absent. The blood plasma coagulates quickly, whereas as we observe the lymph plasma that coagulates slowly. As we observe, the coagulating proteins are very less in the amount. And now as we observe the muscle tissue is broadly classified into voluntary muscle tissue, involuntary muscle tissue and cardiac muscle tissue. What is the other name of voluntary muscle? The skeletal muscle tissue are striped or striated. What are the other names for the involuntary muscles? One we call it as smooth muscle, one we call it as visceral muscle. What is the other name of cardiac muscle? The rhythmic muscle. And now the nervous tissue. In the nervous tissue, we have to discuss the neurons and neuroglial cells. While discussing the points regarding these tissues, around the questions we have to discuss what type of related bits are going to ask by the examiner. Now we have to observe the question regarding the lymph, muscle tissue and nervous tissue. Now, the most abundant plasma protein. As we observe the blood plasma, in the blood plasma variety of proteins are present. One we call it as albumin, and the second one we call it as globulin, and the third one we call it as fibrinogen, prothrombin, heparin. All these are the plasma proteins. Generally, the plasma proteins are produced by the liver. Now, for example, as we observe the fibrinogen and prothrombin, fibrinogen and prothrombin responsible for the blood coagulation. And what about the heparin that prevents the blood coagulation? What about the globulin that is responsible for the formation of antibodies? What about the albumin? As albumin level falls down in the tissues, what is accumulated? The fluid is accumulated. Such swelling of tissues we call it as edema. These are the hints for this question. Now you have to identify the most abundant plasma protein is. One we call it as fibrinogen, second one we call it as prothrombin, third one we call it as globulin, and the last one we call it as albumin. Now what is the correct answer for this question? That is the fourth option, that is albumin. If albumin level falls down, the tissues are accumulated with the fluid and they undergo swelling. The swelling of tissues we call it as edema. Now we go for the next question. The middleman between blood and tissues. In our body, as we observe the body of vertebrates, for our kind information regarding the mammals, in our body the blood is transported to every part of the body, but some parts in our body receive the blood in the form of the lymph. And now the middleman between the blood and tissue is, one we call it as plasma, one we call it as ECF, one we call it as lymph, and the last one we call it as blood cells. Generally here the student going to make a mistake. What is the middleman between the blood and the tissue? Generally an average student gives the answer lymph, but it is not the correct. As we observe the answer for this question, in the tissues some amount of fluid does not enter into the blood vessels. The fluid that is left over in the tissues, that we call it as extracellular fluid, that is technically known as ECF. So that what is the connecting link between the blood and the tissues? ECF. That ECF is collected by lymph capillaries. They unite to form lymph vessels and goes on. Now you have to imagine the answer for this question is the second option, that we call it as ECF. Now we go for the next question. Erector pili muscles. Again it is repeated, erector pili. Where the erector pili muscles are present? Now our body is covered and protected by skin. In the skin, one part we call it as epidermis and the second one we call it as dermis. In the skin, what are present? The air follicles are present. In the air follicle, what is present? The air is present. at the base of hair follicles in the skin, what type of muscles are present? Erector pili muscles are present. Now they are made by, first option is unstriped involuntary, and the second one we call it as striped voluntary, and the third one we call it as unstriped voluntary, and the fourth one we call it as striped involuntary. For this question I am giving one hint. The second type of muscles we call it as smooth muscles. The smooth muscles not only present in the visceral organs but also present in the non-visceral organs. Here one example for the non-visceral organ is ciliary body present in the eye, iris present in the eye, and erector pili. All these are the non-visceral organs. Here erector pili is an example of non-visceral organs. In the non-visceral organs also smooth muscles are present. We know very well the smooth muscles are involuntary, and in the smooth muscles the stripes are absent. Based on this hint you have to identify the answer. The first option is correct one, that is unstriped involuntary. Now we go for the next question. Non-visceral organ which consists of visceral muscle. Now you have to identify the glamours of this question. Here the question is non-visceral organ made by visceral muscle. Now again the same explanation. As we observe the second kind of muscles, that we call it as smooth muscle. The smooth muscles are present in the visceral organs. What is one example for the visceral organ? The lungs, the alimentary canal, the urinary bladder, the uterus. All these are the visceral organs. In the visceral organs, what type of muscles are present? The smooth muscles. The smooth muscles not only present in the visceral organs but also present in the non-visceral organs. Now you have to identify. Here what is the non-visceral organ? Iris, tongue, stomach, and heart. In these four options, what is the non-visceral organ? That we call it as iris. In the iris, what are present? The smooth muscles are present. Now what is the answer for this question is the first one, that we call it as iris. Now we go for the next question. Tissue repairing cells of smooth muscle tissue are. Now as we observe the muscle tissue, one we call it as voluntary muscle. The voluntary muscle having the limited power of regeneration, whereas as we observe the smooth muscles, they have the great power of regeneration. In the smooth muscles, if muscle cell is damaged, it is quickly regenerated by what type of regenerative cell? Now you have to identify the answers. Tissue repairing cells of the smooth muscle tissue are: one we call it as the satellite cell, the second one we call it as the pericyte, and the third one we call it as myoblast, and the fourth one we call it as intercalated disc. We are giving some hints regarding. In the voluntary muscles, what are the regenerative cells? Satellite. In the smooth muscles, what are the regenerative cells? Satellite. Now you have to identify the answer for this question. The answer for this question we call it as pericyte. The answer is second. Now we go for the next question. Star-shaped glial cells. Now the student gets one doubt. What are the glial cells? They are supporting cells. Where they are present? In the nervous tissue. Now what we are asking? Star-shaped glial cells with many radiating processes. Now this is one glial cell having the radiating process, appear to be star-shaped. Now star-shaped glial cells with many radiating process. One we call it as oligodendrocyte, second one we call it as astrocyte, third one we call it as microglial cell, and the fourth one we call it as the satellite. Now you have to identify answer for this question. The second option, that we call it as astrocyte. In that word you have to observe astro, A-S-T-R-O. That means because of the radiating process, this cell appears to be star-shaped. So here the answer is the second answer. Now we go for the next question. The blood and brain barrier is formed by. Now this is the star-shaped cell. It we call it as astrocyte. The astrocyte is called blood-brain barrier. The blood is supplied to central nervous system. In the supplying blood, if any toxic materials are present, the toxic materials are eliminated or removed by what type of cells? The astrocytes. Now you have to identify the blood and brain barrier is formed by, one is astrocytes, second one microglial, third one neurons, and the fourth one is oligodendrocytes. Now here the answer is the first one, that we call it as astrocytes. Next question. Which of the following cells represent mononuclear phagocytic? Now we have to discuss this sentence. Automatically we are getting the answer for this question. Which of the following cells represent mononuclear? Only one nucleus is present. Phagocytic. They perform phagocytosis and provide protection. Now identify the options. One we call it as microglial, and the second one we call it as oligodendrocytes, and the third one is astrocytes, and the fourth one is all neuroglial cells. Now what is the correct answer for this question? The microglial cells. In the microglial cells only one nucleus present. It performs phagocytosis. By phagocytosis it provides protection to the nervous system. Now the answer is the first one. Move for the next question. Elongated glial cells of CNS. What is meant by CNS? Central nervous system. Derived from mesoderm, or one we call it as oligodendrocytes, one we call it as ependymal cells, one we call it as microglial cells, one we call it as astrocytes. Now elongated glial cells of central nervous system. In the central nervous system, myelinated axon, non-myelinated axons are present. Here in the myelinated axons, this we call it as axon. Around myelinated axon, what is present? Myelin sheath. Such myelin sheath in the central nervous system is produced by oligodendrocytes. Now the answer is the first option.